Okay, well, welcome. Let's get started. My name is Keith Please, and I have been helping with the programming some for Jenkins World. I'm the DevSecOps track chair, and one of the things that we did was we put together an industry panel, and being later in the conference, what we have here is something that I would say is pretty advanced. Not only do we have automation, we have containers on top of that, and then we make it a trifecta by adding security. So this is an industry panel on container security. We have somebody representing the customer on the left, and that would be her. We have Chris. We have an analyst, and he tells her what to buy from these guys. We have a couple of folks representing kind of the vendor side of it, the people that create some of that tooling. So each of them is going to introduce themselves. We've got a couple of questions that we've talked about. Chris has got some research from the analysts about what customers such as yourself are asking. And then honestly, most of this we're hoping that you guys are going to have questions. I'll run the mic out to you. We'll get it all recorded. Sound good? Why don't we kick it off? Would you like to go first?
Sure, no problem. Hi, I'm Shannon Leitz. I work for Intuit. I run the red team at Intuit. I have about 45 people who do development on AWS for building security functionality for TurboTax and QuickBooks and some of those products.
Hi, I'm Chris Kondo, Senior Analyst with Forrester. I've been with Forrester about 2 years. I cover application development and delivery. Previous to that, I was a software consultant and also a software developer at Microsoft.
Yes, I'm Matthew Barker, Solution Architect with Twistlock. Twistlock has a cloud and Docker container security platform. I've been in DevSecOps longer than it was a hashtag for about 8 years now.
What's been longer than that?
Hi, Kurt Yanko with Sonatype. I do alliances and strategy, but the real thing is I've been doing DevOps and DevSecOps evangelism going back to my days at Cigna, and I've just been able to transfer a lot of that for a company that allows that to happen.
Chris, you've done some research.
Sure.
Customers talk to you.
Yes, customers talk to me. So as an analyst at Forrester, we publish reports, and people who read those reports have a little button that says request an inquiry. And a lot of times they request inquiries about security and CI and CD. And one of the questions that they often ask is, or actually a problem that was actually presented the other day was, we are using a CI tool with a platform which happened to be from Red Hat, I think it's OpenShift, and in order to use this tool, it needs administrative privileges on the machine. And after we went through this process of selecting this platform, our security team told us we can't use it because it requires admin privileges. That's one question. You want me to go through all of them, or you want to do one at a time?
We're hoping that the audience then will help you.
Yeah,
No,
exactly.
actually, you've got a couple more. What else are they?
The other one is how do you manage credentials within a container? Like how do you securely manage that? How do you insert them in? How do you have it go all the way through its life cycle so that it's secure and that it doesn't introduce any vulnerabilities once it's been put into production? And then the third one, I believe, is about
Compliance.
compliance. Yes. So when you're dealing in a regulated industry, we see a lot of companies coming in from the insurance, from medical, from financial, or from aerospace, highly regulated industries are like, all right, well, we're jumping in now, but we have all these manual compliance steps. How do we automate that? And how do these security tools, how can they help us do that?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So which one do you guys want to tackle first? You want to tackle credentials? Actually, do a quick show of hands. We have credentials, we have admin privileges, and we have compliance. Who's most interested in admin privileges? Okay, who's most interested in credentials? And who's most interested in compliance? You guys, you're throwing off the cues. All right, so why don't we start with credentials? That seemed to be the...
It seemed to be pretty evenly spread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Credentials?
Well, I want to hear from Shannon on first because she does this more in
Oh,
practice.
good God.
I knew that they were going to
No, wait. The vendors go first, right? I'm always last.
I'm willing to
Go
tackle
ahead.
this one.
I can take it, though.
Yeah.
Credentials are easy.
Yeah.
I'm a user of your thing, so actually, why don't you use my credentials?
I want to use your credentials.
yeah.
All right. Well, for credential management in a CI/CD pipeline, we leverage a lot of secrets capabilities, secrets management. In AWS specifically, there's secrets manager capability, which is built on top of Vault. We've leveraged Vault in the past. We've built our own through Gazang, making it so that you can insert code into whatever the pipeline is so that it can retrieve the secrets. If you're not familiar with the turtles problem, it's turtles all the way down, right? Secrets are hard to protect, and one of the ways that we've been able to do that has been making it so that we have a device identity, device authentication, so being able to, like in a cloud environment, looking to see what the instance is, does it pertain to the account that you're trying to authenticate, and leveraging that as part of your scope for securing those credentials.
Okay, cool. You vendor perspective on credentials?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Shannon's exactly right. You want to find a good secrets vault technology, whether it's AWS or use HashiCorp, CyberArk. There are quite a few secrets management vendors. Some of the no-nos around this is putting secrets in your image or injecting secrets as environment variables when you launch the container. So the Twistlock security platform, what it provides in this area is the ability to interface with your vault and automatically securely inject secrets into your containers where they're not visible outside the container, they're not in your image. So these are two kind of important principles, is never store secrets in your image, and make sure that you securely inject them in your containers, and that's kind of where we come into play. We interface with secret vaults with AWS or Google Cloud, secrets management, et cetera, to accomplish that.
Kurt, you have anything you'd like to add?
We don't have a lot to add on from our perspective because we're in the open source intelligence piece, so we're not in this game. I was going to throw in that I saw your demo yesterday. I think you also can inspect an image if somebody hard-coded some secrets in it, right? So you can kind of pick up on the no-no cases, and then provide a positive way to do it, right?
Yeah, so we can scan all the images and tell you if you have secrets stored in them. We also actually do compliance on containers. This is often overlooked. How you launch your container, if you do it in an insecure way. So if you put in a secret that's visible when you launch the container, our compliance checks actually check for things like that. So we're making sure that you're leveraging this secrets technologies that Intuit uses, but we can check your entire ecosystem for these kind of issues.
Okay. And Shannon, from your perspective on the compliance, are you looking for the compliance to be supported by the tools, or do you have to do quite a bit more beyond what they give you?
Yeah, so compliance is a meta problem, and you're going to get parts of the tools that are going to help you with that. When they leave compliance out, it's actually really disruptive because then you actually have to augment whatever the tool is. So I always advocate to get compliance into whatever tool I'm purchasing. And then on the meta problem, what we've found is that when we're looking at compliance issues, they're part of how we deal with like adversary testing. We go through the process of ticketing and putting that into backlogs and painting that with our compliance elements so that we can have a dashboard for it. Most of that hooks into all the tools we use. We leverage both Sonatype and Twistlock and several, and actually many hundreds of others. I might even have other vendors in the audience that we leverage. And, orchestrating that is actually quite complicated when you start looking at the cloud and containers and serverless and some of those techniques. So I really think it's about the company and its capability map.
Okay. And then the third, did you have more to add to that?
No,
Oh,
actually, what I was kind of wondering is some of these solutions sound kind of complex, like you have to put a lot of things together to actually create a complete solution. How many different tools are involved in actually orchestrating that kind of a secure container kind of credential system? Is it one tool from you, or is it 6 different tools from 6 different vendors to make it all work? It's just,
Well,
It's complicated, it
it's more
sounds like.
complicated than that because we haven't even mentioned the platform that they're being deployed
That's
on.
true, right.
And the tools that we're using to build it and deliver it,
Right.
DevOps, why we're here.
Yeah.
It's a very complex ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's also evolving pretty quickly. I guess that's another one. We were, recognizing that much of what we say, like some of it about secrets and so on, is probably good guidance. But if you get very specific on a point solution and you come back next year, the guidance might very well be different. In fact, it probably will. Okay, so we took a couple of issues that was surfaced by the research guys, and we talked a little bit about it. I can throw the field open here and ask anybody who wants to ask a question. We certainly have more stuff, but is there something that's a burning issue that you'd like us to address here? You've got a lot of horsepower on the stage.
Bring it on.
Yeah, anybody just if you raise your hand, I'll bring the mic up. Anything? Okay, we've got one here. I'm going to bring
It's
you
easy
the
for
mic.
me to say because I'm not answering the question.
You're off the hook.
Taking notes.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm from Optimizely, and I would love to get your thoughts on a problem I had very recently. So I found, particularly with container security, that there's a lot of tools out there that will help you either validate your current security state, or will be more of the scanning type and alert you to issues that there are. But what I haven't found a great solution for, which I have found for hardening operating systems and the like, is tools that actually will implement certain security standards for you. So maybe the things that are laid out in a CIS benchmark, there is things on Ansible Galaxy that will do that for you. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on actually implementing Docker security or container security more broadly, I guess.
It's become a big thing for us. We've taken on a Kubernetes journey. We recently purchased a company, Aplatix, which is an orchestration company. We've found that we're actually having to build a lot of these things. So CIS benchmarks, being able to put those back out. There are a few out there, so it depends on what operating system you're leveraging. It depends on what you're building. There's all sorts of capabilities. I feel like this is a space, containers itself, that's actually still pretty immature when it comes to security. So you don't see a lot of the researchers out there actually starting to build those things just yet. But I do know that it's emerging and beginning. There's only a few enterprises that I know that are doing it end to end as part of the fabric of their organization. And those tend to drive the market for solutions and capabilities until they kind of get off their butts and start doing these things. It's kind of one of the things that we have to, as a community, solve for. I've seen a few areas where we're starting to see CIS benchmarks, but my friend here from Twistlock, I'm sure, has a better set of answers than I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Shannon. So we're very tied into the CIS community. We basically have, in the Twistlock platform, have implemented checks for CIS Docker standards, CIS Kubernetes, and then host-specific CIS checks, like if you're on a Red Hat or Ubuntu, etc. So we're doing both host complier and host container and image compliance from CIS, and it's fairly automated. We will, with a simple policy in place, actually out of the box, we do all the checks and report on them. What we're adding on top of that is the ability, for example, to block a deployment that's not compliant. And you can pick and choose which compliance checks are important to you. Another value add-on we did is CIS, it's either on or off. Like it's either pass or fail. What we did is we took the over 300 CIS compliance checks and we scored them just like you would with vulnerabilities. We have low, medium, high, and critical. So enterprises can focus on the more critical problems first and not just say, we have 200 compliance violations, what do we do? The last thing we recently added, I think is really cool, when there is a compliance violation, you can drill down into it and actually see the remediation. So we don't do the remediation, I think you mentioned that, We tend not to do that because it's usually kind of a choice of which ones you want to fix, but we actually show you, okay, so you have this compliance violation, this is how you fix it. So that remediation piece, our customers find, really useful.
Yeah, you want that checker-doer separation too. You don't want your audit tool to be the doer, because then it's not your audit tool anymore.
That's a great point, actually.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
Now you have to audit the audit
Right,
tool.
right. Yeah, now and then you're back into turtles all the way down. From our view on compliance, there's still some issues that linger from traditional software that we're now containerizing. So for us, it's just still about making sure that, containers are great because they really want to limit your surface area. They want to limit your attack. I mean, when you first look at Docker, you think, wow, this actually seems pretty secure. I've got, the power of SE Linux behind me. We've got all this separation, process isolation. There's a lot of things this container can't do. So you have that, but the reality is, if you deploy an app that has a vulnerability like that we read about in the paper every other week these days, or some company gets breached, that can all still happen, right? You can still get into that container, you can still pivot around and find data, you can still do all that sort of stuff. So, although there are some emerging techniques that help address that, but so we're really interested in, from a compliance standpoint, making sure you're using healthy software, right? That the dependent components that are going in there are, I always hate to say known free of vulnerabilities, but we don't know of the vulnerabilities, right? I don't think anything's known free of vulnerabilities. We haven't found anything yet, more often than not. And then there's also still licensing compliance, right? So all those issues still apply, right? The types of open source licenses that are in there. So you have these types of issues. And then there's just sometimes architectural contracts that you want to enforce with your teams to make sure it's being built to the standard that your company has sort of set forth. So that's where we play a role, and we do that for the world before containers, but it's all the same problems in containers. So we still play that role there and try and make sure that you are limiting your attack surface, minimizing that attack surface, getting out known vulnerabilities, and making sure you're clean from a licensing standpoint.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, Curtis. That's a really good point. A classic example of this is the Equifax breach. With a vulnerability in Struts 2, basically enabled the breachers to run any script of their choice within the cluster. So they've already gotten past all the endpoint protection, all your perimeter defenses. And so if you don't have protection inside your cluster as well, also weeding out the vulnerability, obviously. But even if you have like there are, like he says, unknown vulnerabilities, there's zero-day vulnerabilities, there's vulnerabilities in the source code that are undetected. You need protection within the cluster against attacks and not just endpoint protection. And so that's kind of where we come into play. So if there is a vulnerability where they're able to run any script they want in your cluster, they've gotten past your wide area firewall, your WAF, your endpoint protection. You need protection against breaking out of containers, going to other containers, or going on the host and running malicious code, et cetera. And that's kind of where we play in with when there is vulnerability issues that get attacked. We have active defense for that.
And actually, I've got a question. I see you have a question, right? I've got one that touches on an issue that we talked about. And let's start with Chris. Who is asking you these questions? Is this coming from the ops guys? Is this coming from DevOps? Is this coming from leadership? Is this coming from dev teams?
These are typically teams that identify themselves as DevOps leaders. They are trying to figure out how to, automate and go faster. I don't typically field calls directly from like IT professionals. I usually go to another team that's called infrastructure and operations. So they might be getting very similar calls from a different audience, but I get them because I focus on developer, application development and delivery. I get it directly from either dev teams who are doing it themselves and trying to figure out like we own this piece of the puzzle, so we need to figure out how to make it more secure, or from a self-identified like DevOps team or team lead who's trying to understand, how they manage compliance and all these other types of issues that go with, working in a containerized world.
So you're also not getting this from the security professionals.
No, the security folks don't. So this is the weird thing about Forrester is that like there's a security analyst as well. Her name is Amy DeMartine, and she's probably getting these things from CISOs and stuff. And they're asking her probably the same question, but from a completely different angle. I'm getting it from a point of view of how do I automate it?
Okay. Which is
What we're here for. How do I get it right in my CI/CD pipeline, and how do I automate it? They're probably getting questions like, what is that thing? What is a container?
So,
I don't, maybe not, I don't know.
so following up on the vulnerability concerns that you guys brought up, wouldn't you say that once your everything, say all your CI/CD toolchain is in the cloud, the security that the cloud provides is sufficient for most use cases? Like if I make an app which tells the weather.
Hold on.
We'll let
We got a hot
no,
answer
we'll let
already.
a real
Stop
enterprise
right
for you.
there before you hurt yourself.
a typical app. Most use cases.
So done right, the cloud can be more secure than a data center. That done right piece is really important. I've seen lots of folks in the industry end up with stuff that's available on the internet that shouldn't be, like Jenkins servers, open and exposed, unsecured, unhardened. Back to the hardening question. The cloud itself is a great capability, but it doesn't by default necessarily provide you with the strongest capability. It's still really easy to make mistakes in the cloud, and it's pretty easy to have those exposed from a bad guy perspective. Things like scanning to make sure that you've closed down your security groups if you're in AWS, if you're in Azure or GCP, looking at how you've actually set up your environments and how they're actually secured by firewalls and host capabilities is helpful. And then like looking at your IAM permissions, your IAM roles, all those things are really helpful. But I think it's really about like the scope, that zoning and containment principle has to be pretty much nailed, or you could end up with just as many problems as if you were running this stuff in a data center.
I was going to add, last year we did an evaluation of CI/CD tools, and one of the interesting things is that when we were interviewing people that did hosted tool chains, is they were very confused by the methodology of managing accounts and authentication and credentials. And some of these tools connect directly to GitHub, and so they thought, all right, well, that's going to be all imported, and everything that's secure there is going to be secure here. And they just assumed a lot of defaults that just weren't true. And they left themselves exposed to vulnerabilities without realizing it, because it was just a different paradigm than the one they were used to using, which was on-premise, which maybe they use ADFS or some other system of security. And this other one was they just weren't skilled with it, and they didn't understand all the ins and outs.
Yeah, I think the other thing to consider too, and I was just thinking about it while you were talking, was supply chain. You did give me some space. So while supply chains are starting to move out, they're becoming actually a bigger target for adversaries. Yeah. There's more CI/CD going out there, so there's greater interest by adversaries. They're easier to find. There's a lot more auto route capabilities, meaning automation on the bad guy side, to find and discover these things. And what you'll find is that if it has been broken into 10 times over, I usually see cryptocurrency mining happening on those systems because it's super easy to find them, and basically the script to get in and do something useful is already pre-written.
Yeah, and I just want to tack on a little bit. It doesn't matter if it was containers or data centers, and even if you had all of your security done really well, you still have to let customers come onto your app. And that app will have access to data. Yeah. And if there's a weakness in it, you can have perfect security all around it, and I have a path straight to the data behind it, right? So when the Canadian IRS got hit by that same Struts thing, it went right, it had access to all their users' data. So it can be, even in that perfect environment, it's still right there for the taking. You're one vulnerability away from being exposed.
Yeah, I mean, he's exactly right. The Equifax breach, no cloud security would have caught that, because it was a vulnerability in the app that allowed them to run a script within the cluster past all the security. But when it comes to cloud configuration to make it secure, because you obviously can do it right or do it wrong, as Shannon mentioned, having a tool that actually checks your configuration and finds security issues is very useful, right? Because you can do it the right way, you can do it the wrong way. Just like storing secrets in images, running containers as privileged or root, which elevates attack surfaces. The cloud providers give you the tools to lock all that down, but they give you the leeway to open it up as well. So having a tool to check your cloud security configuration is a big part of the solution.
Is there a question back
Yeah, there's one right here.
Yes, so you mentioned about supply chain. So any thoughts on emerging APIs, frameworks like Graphias, Curtis? There is something called in toto. So these are kind of frameworks which help you control the overall supply chain, like going back to vulnerabilities in components like struts or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely provide the mechanisms by which once you know something, you can sort of tag it and prevent it from moving, right? And that's really important in the world of a code commit could produce a production deploy in a matter of minutes or hours, right? So with no intervention, right? So having those mechanisms in place is really important. What I was going to get at, though, is Shannon touched on this. We're definitely seeing, people are going after your suppliers, right? So they're typo squatting. They're putting out packages that are a character off of a popular package, hoping people make a mistake. They're intentionally putting out malware, but then going to a bunch of other projects and updating their dependencies, so now it's coming in. We're just seeing a whole new slew of attacks on the reservoir, the supply system itself, and we're unwittingly coming from the Docker 123321 registry with all the crypto mining malware in that, and that's the other thing is, we've touched on it, but there's a real shift happening right now where people are less interested in your data because that means I have to go to the dark web and sell it, and now I've got to do another transaction, and that's going to take time. If I can get you to run crypto mining in your AWS on your nickel, it's just money dripping into my account. And you'll eventually maybe catch it and turn it off, but I'll come in another door, another time, and I'll just keep at it, right? And we'll just keep making money off your electric bill.
Right here.
Hi, Andy Birchall from CIBC. So what if you're an organization that doesn't really know where your baseline for security stands, right? We've stood up a bunch of tools. We kind of have status quo, but what kind of questions should we be asking our partners and our vendors? How do you kind of like baseline that? Where do you begin, I guess, right? Because we're just starting our journey. And not every team in our bank is going to be Dockerized, right? It's not going to be in the cloud. To your point, the admin question around OpenShift, how do you flush that kind of stuff out early, right?
So you want to lock the door before the horse is gone? Okay.
Figure that stuff out afterwards,
And read about it on CNN. Yeah.
There's a couple of early things that you can do to really help your organization start the journey. The two that come to mind for me is one of the things that we did early on was really try to control our recursive DNS. Anything going out from us to the internet, we actually started catching it. We're leveraging OpenDNS. We use that on everything. We peppered all of our laptops, our mobile devices, our cloud instances, and everything inside of our data center. So it's almost like having one big logical perimeter, if you will. That's been really helpful because we can actually see what people are going out to, how many connections have actually been made, and that does give us a sense of like, hey, these are some of our most critical dependencies. So that gives us a lot of information. That's one way to start that process. The other thing that I would say that's really helped is putting together a central repo and having your developers go to that repo, making sure that everything in that repo has been reviewed, it's actually set up properly, you've got the right understanding, and that you're pruning it all the time so that you're getting rid of stuff that shouldn't be there. You're helping to basically lift the waterline, if you will, against the bad guys.
And I'd add one more thing to that. All of those are perfect first starts. To me, one of the most important scenarios that's often overlooked when it comes to attacks through vulnerabilities is The idea is that you've pruned your repository, you have it clean, you make a deployment, and you now are in production with those containers running in the cloud. The number one risk is a new vulnerability comes up. It's not that you didn't do your due diligence, but you have to continuously have a tool that's going to continuously monitor. When a new vulnerability comes up, being able to know exactly the risk scope of that new vulnerability is important. What images have that vulnerability in your registry, in your deployments, in your ongoing projects? What containers are running in deployment with that image? Are they connected to the internet, exposed ports, etc.? So handling, I like to think of it like automotive recall. In the automotive industry, when there's a defect, they know exactly which car models have that, let's say, bad alternator, and that, more importantly, they know the people that own that car, and they bring those in, and they do it pretty efficiently. In the software industry, we don't have anything like that, and so Twistlock is set up so we profile your entire deployments, and when a new vulnerability comes in, we tell you, hey, it's in these 3 registries, it's in these images, these containers are running, and here's additional risk factors. So you can assess which ones really you want to fix like right away and which ones aren't a big deal.
I would also add, I mean, one of the, I think, advantages we have these days that we didn't necessarily have going too far back is this idea of pipelines, right? And so we have this path where almost everything starts as code, and it has to follow it, and you can, so the question becomes like, what are all the tests I need to put in so I can catch these things early, right? And that's sort of the DevOps message. I want to catch this all very early in the process. If someone's being lazy and starting to create a container that's running as root or privilege, how can I detect that very early and address that very early? So I do think, being here at Jenkins World, we do have access to the basic mechanisms that give us the ability. I think, but the rest of your question is, what are those things? How do I identify those? What tools are out there? But I agree with Shannon. I think that's all emerging. I think we're learning. It's important to get out there and share and talk to Gartner and Forrester, and they'll share with you what those practices are today. And you come back next year, I'm sure they will have evolved.
As we listen to you and learn more.
Right. I'm just, so the thing is, I'm actually pretty excited by containers because what they provide this, what I call a converged supply chain. Like everything is all flowing through your pipelines, and not like 5-6 years ago when I'm deploying to static environments, which are also getting changes coming in from other angles based on ticket systems. It's hard to coordinate and see what's going on. No 2 of my environments were quite the same. So we had all these problems that just don't exist these days because it ends up in this sort of final container. We've had a chance to inspect it dozens of times.
And it's immutable.
And it's immutable, and so there's a lot going for us. And the opportunities are there. I just can't tell you all the boxes you got to check to get it exactly right all the time. But what I can say is we have robots to do it now. We don't have to rely too much on people, so we have that going for us too, which is going to allow us to do this at scale and at speed.
Well, now, speaking of boxes where you would find checklists and stuff, would you guys have a set of resources that you'd recommend? NIST, OWASP, anything that is authoritative in this space?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a few standards out there.
So I think the best standard is the NIST 800 guide. It's basically built for the defense industry, but I'm working with big enterprises like American Express, Capital One and stuff. They're all focusing on the NIST 800. Another emerging guide is High Trust. So I'm seeing those two as some of the better guidelines. Really, the trick is on that, though, is being able to do that in a DevOps way. It's one thing to say, I'm looking for NIST 800 compliance. I want to be secure and follow that guideline. There is some processes in place there, but you need the robots to check through your pipeline that you are moving towards that compliance in an efficient way, and just kind of automatically catching things.
And like going back to our first question about something that required admin privileges, right? And the whole idea of going to least privilege and you know, it's a mindset thing. I mean, it's just so much easier when I have the God bit to do whatever I want. But you know, you have to factor back from that to that lowest level. Some more questions. Anything else? Run right here. Yeah.
She does, look at her.
Oh,
Yep.
yes.
She's ready to roll.
She can just send you the list and then.
Yeah,
Put it up on the screen.
Yeah.
she's actually ordering ice cream.
So, you know, like when you use a repo like in Docker Hub to store your images, they have a tool to scan the vulnerabilities so you're aware of them, right? But if you store your Docker images in something like AWS ECR, what products Twistlog or Sonatype have to scan that ECR?
In my view, in my own pipelines, I'm doing those scans prior to getting to the registry. In fact, my scans can fail the pipeline and not even push it to the registry because I want to fail as soon as possible. So I don't want to get it there and then scan it and find out I can't use it because now I'm just collecting things I got to clean up.
And
But-
that's life cycle?
Right. Yeah, so Lifecycle will give us some scans. Now, we're focused on the open source in your apps and some of the top layers of your containers. You would probably want to complement that with another tool that's really a little bit focused on the lower layers, like the OS. And then there's something that you're going to look at and make sure it's also configured right. Like, it's not always just manifest and what's in there. It's who's it running as? Is the, you know, are the structures in there to your standards? So it's one of these things where I feel like you probably need at least 2, if not 3 different ways of looking at it to make sure it meets all of your requirements. I mean, there's, you know, some different tools that can do that. But yeah,
that
we
tool
definitely
would
do it
be-
for the app layer, and there's stuff that does the lower. You guys do it as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I want to say it's a bit of a landmine to say I've got a secure registry and all the images in it are good. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but realize it doesn't end there because new vulnerabilities are discovered every day. So don't get too caught up in that my registry is clean today. There's going to be ongoing maintenance. So what we do as Twistlock is you can configure our platform to connect to any one or more Docker registries, whether it's AWS, Google Cloud, Nexus repository, etc. And what we do is we automatically scan all the images in the registry, and then as new images are pushed, we automatically scan those. But an important piece of that is actually getting alerts in place so you're aware when an image is pushed to the registry that has a vulnerability. It's not enough you don't want manual people looking at your registry scan report every day and say, oh, is it clean or not? You want a DevOps way of doing this. So you want alerts that generate tickets where they remediate these problems. And you also want to know for those images in the registry what's actually in our deployment. So when you get one of those tickets, a new vulnerability occurs, it's in 3 images in your registry. Is it in our deployment? And do we need to act quickly? So it's really a point-in-time scan or even a registry scan is not sufficient, but we certainly provide that.
So I was in your presentation yesterday, and your product, it's like you have to install it on your servers, or how that works?
Yeah, so we're basically an on-premise solution. We don't believe that enterprises want to send images outside of their control. So we're very easy deployment. Kubernetes, it's a 2-line deployment into Kubernetes. We have a Helm chart to deploy in Kubernetes. So it's a very quick and easy deployment and upgrade. But yes, it's on premise. And then once the product's installed, with a few clicks, you can connect to your registries. And what's nice is once you connect to a registry, we scan everything in the registry. And new images are pushed, we scan those as well. So it's a lot of automation, but you do have to install the product.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Anybody? Another one? Great.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. Like, so is there a drawback to using automated tools compared to like manually testing the live running system? Yeah.
We did talk about why automated security, right?
Right. So You could supposedly run an automation tool and think that you're completely covered and have sort of a false sense of security. That's one thing that I could see as maybe a drawback, but it's not a drawback to the automation. It's how it's actually employed. It doesn't, it's sort of like the same story we've been telling almost every answer. You have to be vigilant with every single technology you use. You have to understand all the vulnerabilities and what the automation is actually trying to defend against. And so, and there's no one piece of automation that really solves all the problems, right? Which is the other follow-up question we had. I was like, how do you string this security solution together? And it depends on which platform you're on. So the drawback to automation is that it's hard to do. It requires people who are skilled at those tools. They need to remain up to date on those skills. But the advantage of doing that, the investment you put in that time, means that it's a repeatable process every single time. And so the return on investment is very high, even though that investment is kind of steep to begin with. Because the opposite is if everyone's doing things manually and you have all these snowflake sort of tests and manuals, like you might test it one way and the person who's on duty the next time might read things completely differently on those tests and do it completely differently. And so you both felt you did 100% test, yet you both tested it completely differently because you're people and people do things differently and they interpret things differently. So there's definitely a cost to automation. There's definitely complexity to automation, but in the end, it's worth it, but it doesn't actually mitigate or relieve you of the duty of actually understanding what that automation is doing and how it's doing it.
Yeah.
That was good enough.
Also, what do you think about BSD jails?
BSD what?
Jails.
I had never been to jail. What'd you say?
No, BSD jails.
I'm not familiar with that.
Never mind.
Shannon?
It's like the change route for BSD.
Useful, hard, and you need to find people who have the skills and capabilities to deal with BSD. Having been a BSD programmer a long time ago, and I'm not going to say how long ago, but I think it's a really useful capability. Almost like SE Linux, though, like the thing about jails and setting these things up is the harder it becomes, the more complexity gets generated. So you're going to get bound to a specific set of people who have to work with it. It also becomes a barrier to entry for automation and also off-the-shelf capabilities if it's not supported. Most of the commercial packages out there don't support it, so it does become a little bit of an onerous piece of the puzzle.
I think you had another one?
So my question now is a bit more people-focused. So I'm thinking particularly in the case of kind of like Docker files or like container images in general, or even Docker runtime. So I think it's all fine and good to kind of like lint for certain like things you don't want people to do in your Docker file, or ways that you want people to like run their containers in the first place. But how, what are some success strategies for communicating out those best practices to your developers and the people that are actually like working with these technologies day to day, in order to avoid having like a central team that is somehow now responsible for everyone's containers?
Yeah, one of the ways in which I've seen that work well is building a CLI for the organization and having some way to check in information as part of the best practices, where to find things, and that CLI sort of becomes a community CLI. That's the best way I've seen it. Some of the other ways, it's a wiki, it's a checklist, it's a something, or it actually does become a team. It could end up becoming a central team that does some sort of service provision. I tend to like the CLI better than everything else, because then you're kind of letting bits fly and people can start to do pull requests. We have something called OIP, which is a patterns repository, not necessarily managed by any one central team, but pretty much managed by the collective and the community. So you get really interesting opinions, and you also get a little bit of friction to be able to help ensure the best practices there.
Yeah, absolutely. From a vendor standpoint, one of the things I advocate is that the whole pipeline when you're building your app and doing compliance and vulnerability checks at build, if the developer, if that's the first time they see the issues, if it's thrown back on them and saying, you've got to fix all these vulnerabilities, it tends to be kind of culturally creating those silos between security and development. So a CLI tool or a tool to be able to scan for compliance and vulnerabilities at the developer desktop, to me, is going to help break down those silos. So the developer may not do it, but if you've offered that opportunity for them to check things when they're picking their base image, when they're picking the components in their app, et cetera, their source code scanning as well, if they are presented the opportunity to do those checks before they check in their code, so they're not pushed back a whole host of problems that they're not even aware of, that really helps culturally. And by the way, it also helps for efficiency. It's a shift far left approach to security.
Yeah, I would agree. I was going to say this is, we're really talking about why shift left is so important and why in the context of DevOps, feedback is so important. This is just a form of feedback. If I can very early in construct phase, when you do your local build, say, hey, that might be a problem and point that out to you, that's the ideal time while you're still thinking about it to fix it, learn from that, and move on. And this, we see this all the time, the culture of how to do things right is always a moving target. Frameworks are moving on us, technologies are moving on us, so it's always a moving target. So the feedback's really important so that they're learning from their mistakes as they're making them, and in a way, like you said, in a timely place. Like you don't want it to be after they break the build and they get the scornful little thing in their cube that says you broke the build. You want it to be early enough to say, oh, you're not going to commit now, because if you do, you're going to break the build. So fix it and then do it, right? So it's all about feedback and timing, and then having it in where they can absorb from that and learn from it, learn from their mistakes as they go.
And another thing I'll add in that area is I saw a guy walking around this morning. He had a shirt that said "No false positives." That's pretty critical as well. So if your scanning tool is producing false positives, particularly when you do it at build and they don't do it at the desktop, and then they push those false positives back to the developer and says, fix all these, and he goes to fix them and says, well, this utility has a patch that fixed that vulnerability. That's also going to create those silos that you want to eliminate. So find a tool and really check it to make sure the scan results aren't having false positives.
Now, I saw that, and I thought, that was interesting.
Saw that guy.
Are you more worried about a false positive or a false negative?
Well, it's really weird. Interesting. The security team is worried about false negatives. And a lot of these security scanning tools sell to the security team, and that's why they're wrought with false positives. But we're at a DevOps conference. The DevOps operations hate false positives. So you have to be concerned about both, one for security and one for efficiency, and also those silos that are going to get generated, right? And you're going to lose confidence in the tool, and you're going to lose security as well.
That's the key. If we're giving that feedback and you quickly kind of learn this isn't even really valid feedback, you just tune it out. So the whole point of automation is that it's reliable, and the minute it's not reliable, it gets dismissed or not used or ignored. So you want to lose their cultural attention, put a lot of false positives in front of them.
All right, I think we're at the end, but you one more question, right? Can you be a quick one? Pretty quick?
I don't think so. She's being nice.
So I think her question, correct me if I'm wrong, was how to communicate best practices when working with Docker files and things that you don't want people to do in Docker files. And you mentioned CLI, and for me, maybe I'm the only one, but it wasn't clear how you use a CLI to implement best practices when creating Docker files.
Mm-hmm. You might have something that you have in your Docker file that you want to have be a consistent standard, looking up standards that might exist, putting those into the CLI so that you can actually get that information as part of what you're trying to achieve. Also, integrating other CLIs with that single CLI. I know that's actually been really helpful for us, is that there's one thing to go to that actually helps to build practice in the organization, because you're not going to get best practices outside in the world that actually apply to your culture and the way that you do DevOps that are going to be easily achieved. So I hope that kind of answered the question. I understand the Docker file bits specifically. It's a little bit more complicated than we have time. I'm more than happy to talk about
Handle that
offline.
afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think we reached the end of our time. I want to thank our illustrious panelists. This is where you get to applaud. That was some loud clapping there.